Okay, so while Native Americans and African Americans still supported Roosevelt in large numbers despite some racially biased elements of the New Deal, many others critics strongly opposed Roosevelt and his policies. Earl Browder, the leader of the Communist Party, argued in 1934 that Roosevelt's program was no different from that of finance capitalists worldwide, even comparing it to Hitler's program in Germany. Many Republican business executives were furious about Roosevelt's push for a welfare state and his support for labor unions, and some were so angry they refused to even say his name, referring to him simply as that man in the White House. Now, one of the most vocal and powerful critics of Roosevelt came from within his own party in the form of Huey Pierce Long Jr., a colorful and controversial Democratic senator from Louisiana. He was a flamboyant figure known for his rowdy curly hair and his bold theatrical political style. He was a classic demagogue. He appealed to the emotions of the people and earned the nickname the Messiah of the Rednecks. The son of a poor farmer, he wore flashy clothes and claimed to be leading a crusade to serve the poor. And as governor and later as a U.S. senator, he pushed for taxing the rich to benefit the poor, which made him immensely popular in his home state of Louisiana. In fact, though he used his power in ways that were quite controversial, he was threatening, bribing, manipulating people, which earned him the title Dictator of Louisiana. Though he reduced taxes, improved infrastructure, and built hospitals, his tactics were often quite ruthless. So in 1933, Long initially supported Roosevelt and the New Deal, but quickly grew disillusioned with the National Recovery Administration's cooperation with big business. Ambitious to become president himself, he challenged Roosevelt with his share of the wealth society, as his plan backed heavy promises or included heavy taxes on the wealthy, giving $5,000 to poor families, $2,500 of annual income to wage workers, pensions for retirees, and other promises like reducing the work week and providing bonuses to veterans. So despite the plan's financial impracticality, Long was confident it would resonate with the public. He often said, maybe somebody says I don't understand government finance. Well, you don't have to. Just shut your eyes and believe it. All right, so whenever somebody tells you, you don't have to understand how it works, you don't need to know, I don't need to know, nobody needs to know. Just shut your eyes and believe it, and it will be true. That should automatically be like, you should be questioning that like 100%. Right out of the gate. Anyway, so Long believed he had enough support to challenge Roosevelt, even claiming that Roosevelt was scared of him because he knows that I can outpromise him, right? So Roosevelt goes on to declare him one of the two most dangerous men in the country during this time period because he's throwing out a pipe dream, basically. One of the president's critics, Francis E. Townsend, was a retired doctor from California who proposed a bold plan to help the older Americans. In 1934, after witnessing three elderly women searching through garbage for food, Townsend developed the Townsend Recovery Plan, and he called for the federal government to pay $200 a month to every American over age 60 who agreed to retire. Recipients would need to spend the money each month in order to stimulate the economy, but Townsend argued that this plan would open up jobs for younger workers and boost economic activity by increasing consumer spending. However, like Huey Long's Share the Wealth proposal, Townsend's plan doesn't really have financial feasibility, so it would require paying retirees, only about 9% of the population, more than half of the nation's total income. So despite its impracticality, the plan gained significant support amongst the older Americans, who inundated the White House with letters urging Roosevelt to adopt it. Another very vocal critic was Father Charles E. Coughlin, a Roman Catholic priest from Detroit, who hosted his own radio show that could reach up to 40 million listeners every single week. So as fascism and Nazism grew in Europe during the 1930s, Coughlin's rhetoric started turning increasingly anti-Semitic, and he accused Roosevelt of being controlled by the international Jewish bankers and mockingly referred to the New Deal as the Jew Deal. So he also goes as far as praising Hitler for killing the Jews, believing that it was justified because all Jews were in fact communists. By the 1940 presidential campaign, Coughlin's extremism and hateful rhetoric, including a Nazi salute and threats against American Jews, sparked widespread backlash, as you might imagine. And in the mid-1930s, Coughlin's influence was at its peak. But by the late 1940s, or late 1940, rather, his program was pulled. So a 1935 poll reviewed that Long could draw over 5 million votes as a third-party candidate, potentially threatening Roosevelt's chances of re-election, though. So Long is really the problem here for Roosevelt in the election. All right, so in response to the criticism from figures like Long and Coughlin and Townsend, Roosevelt decided to counter the influence by introducing more progressive programs. So he says, I'm fighting communism, Huey Longism, Coughlinism, and Townsendism, as he explained in 1935, adding that his goal was to save the capitalist system from these crackpot ideas that these, individuals had. So Interior Secretary Harold Ikes echoed the sentiment in his diary, noting that Roosevelt needed to move further to the left to maintain control of the country and avoid a potential social revolution. So the New Deal faced growing opposition, especially from businesses and the Supreme Court, but by the mid-1930s, businesses were filing lawsuits against various New Deal programs, including the Schechter Poultry Corporation versus the U.S. Supreme Court, as it had unanimously struck down the National Industrial Recovery Act, ruling that the NRA gave too much power to the president by allowing businesses and labor leaders to create codes of fair competition for industries, violating federal antitrust laws. A few months later, they declared the Agricultural Adjustment Act unconstitutional in U.S. versus Butler, which focused on the act's tax on companies that process crops and store commodities like cotton, arguing that it exceeded federal authority. And in response, Roosevelt's administration would pass the Agricultural Adjustment Act in 1938, which would reinstate crop production payments but remove the tax on the processors. While the revised AAA helped improve the farm economy, critics continued to argue that it gave the government too much power, and by the end of its 1935-36 term, the Supreme Court had ruled against 7 of the 9 major New Deal cases that had been brought before them. So, to protect his legislative agenda and from legal and political obstacles, Roosevelt introduced the Second New Deal in January of 1935, and this phase was more ambitious and transformative than the first New Deal. So during the second 100 days in 1935, Roosevelt persuaded Congress to pass key elements of the Second New Deal. One of the most significant pieces was the Emergency Relief Appropriations Act, which was a $4.8 billion initiative, the largest peacetime spending bill in U.S. history at the time. This act funded the creation of the Works Progress Administration, a massive jobs program led by Harry Hopkins, and it quickly becomes the largest employer in the country, providing jobs for an average of 2 million people annually over the next 4 years. So WP workers accomplished a wide range of projects, such as building 650,000 miles of highways and roads, 8,000 parks, 78,000 bridges, and restored landmarks like the St. Louis riverfront. It also supported cultural initiatives by hiring writers, actors, artists, and musicians through programs like the Federal Theater Project, Art Project, Music Project, and Writers Project. For young Americans, the National Youth Administration was also under the WPA, and it offered part-time jobs to students and aid to unemployed youth. By the time it ended in 1943, it had provided assistance to approximately 9 million people, including many African Americans. The cornerstone of the Second New Deal was the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, after its sponsor, Senator Robert Wagner from New York. Roosevelt supported this legislation, which guaranteed workers the right to organize unions and negotiate directly with employers on wages and working conditions. The act also established the National Labor Relations Board to monitor union activities and ensure employers negotiated in good faith. So these initiatives from the Second New Deal significantly reshaped the American workforce and economy. So it leaves a very lasting impact. Okay, so the Great Depression was particularly devastating for elderly Americans and individuals with disabilities. So to address these needs, President Roosevelt introduced the Social Security Act of 1935, which he described as the cornerstone and supreme achievement of the New Deal. While the idea of government assistance for the elderly and disabled wasn't new, progressives had advocated for it earlier in the 1900s, and other countries had already implemented such programs. The hardships of the Depression gave it a new sense of urgency. With strong leadership, Roosevelt guided this transformative legislation through Congress, aided by Labor Secretary Frances Perkins, the first female to serve in the presidential cabinet. The Social Security Act included 3 main components to it. First was the retirement fund. The act established a federal retirement fund for Americans over 65. Starting in 1937, workers and employers paid into the system through payroll taxes. Most of the funds went to the retirees, with some placed in a trust for future pensions. Roosevelt emphasized that Social Security was meant to supplement other income sources, not guarantee a comfortable retirement. Unemployment insurance, which was a federal state program funded by payroll taxes from employers, providing temporary financial assistance to unemployed workers. And then social welfare programs, which was federal funding supporting state-run programs for old age assistance, aid to dependent children, and aid for the blind. And additional support was provided for maternal care, child welfare, and public health services. So while groundbreaking, the Social Security system was relatively conservative compared to similar systems established in Europe. It was unique in being funded by payroll taxes on workers' earnings rather than general government revenues. However, this system had drawbacks. The regressive payroll tax placed a heavier burden on lower income workers as it used a flat tax rate regardless of income. The program also excluded 9.5 million low-wage workers who needed it the most, like farm laborers, domestic workers, and the self-employed, groups that included a large percentage of African Americans. Southern lawmakers intentionally excluded those workers to avoid taxing white families, employing African American sharecroppers and maids. So despite these compromises, Roosevelt believed workers funding their own Social Security pension would help Americans see their retirement checks as earned entitlements, not government handouts. So the Social Security Act faced fierce opposition. Conservatives attacked it as an overreach of government power, with critics like the National Association of Manufacturers warning it would lead to socialist control of life and industry. Former President Hoover refused to apply for a Social Security card, even though he would be issued one regardless. And it ends up being the foundational, the thing that people most associate with the New Deal is the Social Security Act. Okay, Medicare and Medicaid don't come along till later, by the way. We always kind of throw those three things in together because they are very much interrelated, but that's not going to come around until President Johnson, so we'll get there. All right, so one of the defining pieces of legislation from the Second New Deal was the Revenue Act of 1935, often referred to as the Wealth Tax Act, or more popularly, the Rich Tax. This act sought to raise tax rates on the wealthiest Americans, responding to the widespread frustration over income inequality and revelations of tax evasion amongst the elite. So public outrage grew as stories circulated of how some of the nation's wealthiest individuals exploited loopholes to avoid paying taxes. Good thing they closed all those and that doesn't happen anymore. Oh, wait, no, it still does. My bad. Among the most notorious examples was banker J.P. Morgan, who admitted before a Senate committee that he had engaged in fictitious stock sales, such as selling shares to his wife to completely escape taxation. President Roosevelt championed the act not only as a way to increase government revenue, but also a means of restoring public confidence in the fairness of the economic system. Roosevelt was clear in his intent. He was not dismantling capitalism, but working to try and reform it. He famously declared, "I am fighting communism. I want to save our system, the capitalistic system." Yet he also acknowledged that preserving capitalism required addressing the flaws contained within the system, including the growing inequality in wealth and opportunity. So in Roosevelt's view, economic stability and fairness demanded a more equitable distribution of wealth, ensuring that the system worked for all Americans and not just an elite few. The act faced harsh criticism from wealthy individuals and business leaders who saw it as an attack on their success and an intrusion into free enterprise. Newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst went so far as to describe the tax as essentially communism, reflecting the widespread fear among the rich that Roosevelt's policy signaled a dangerous drift towards socialism. Despite such accusations, Roosevelt remained steadfast, countering that saving capitalism required action against all unethical practices of certain capitalists. Like Teddy Roosevelt before him, he did not oppose the economic system itself, but strongly disliked the exploitation and unfair behavior of those who abused the power within it. The Revenue Act of 1935 symbolized that belief of reforming the system being essential to capitalism's survival. By addressing glaring inequities and curbing abuses, he believed that this would would result in the protection of capitalism from the extremism of both communism and unchecked greed. The act became a cornerstone of the broader effort to balance fairness with economic growth, helping to maintain public confidence in his New Deal vision and the idea that government could create a system that worked for all of its citizens. So, the New Deal played a critical role in revitalizing the labor union movement, as the National Industrial Recovery Act required industry fairness codes to recognize workers' rights to organize. Many workers interpreted this as a direct support from Roosevelt to join unions, leading to a surge in union activity. John L. Lewis, the head of the United Mine Workers, seized this momentum, and under his leadership, it grew rapidly, expanding to 500,000 members in just a single year. Inspired by Lewis's achievements, Sidney Hillman of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers and David Dubinsky of the International Ladies Garment Workers took steps to organize workers in their clothing industry. They promoted the concept of industrial unions, which brought together all workers, both skilled and unskilled, within a single industry. And this approach clashed with the smaller craft unions, which focused solely on skilled male workers and restricted membership to specific trades. The passage of the Wagner Act further bolstered the industrial union movement, and this act prompted industrial unions to create the Committee of Industrial Organization in order to advance their goals. However, tensions with the American Federation of Labor led to the AFL expelling CIO unions in 1936. In response, the CIO established itself as an independent organization, later known as the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and it concentrated its efforts on organizing major industries like automobiles and steel, though companies resisted fiercely, often using intimidation tactics to weaken union efforts. In 1937, for instance, union workers took a bold turn with the introduction of the sit-down strike, where workers refused to leave the workplace until their employers agreed to collective bargaining rights. One of the most famous strikes occurred at General Motors plant in Flint, Michigan, led by the determined Walter Reuther. Thousands of workers halted production and barricaded themselves inside of the plant, and in response, the company turned off the heat, cut off food supplies, used tear gas, and called in police to harass the strikers. Executives even appealed to Roosevelt to send federal troops, but he declined, though he disapproved of the strike. The strike lasted over a month before General Motors gave in, recognizing the United Automobile Workers as a legitimate union, and this victory was dubbed the strike that was heard around the world, as it energized the labor movement and it saw an increase in membership. The New Deal's policies and key union victories like the Flint strike marked a turning point, solidifying labor unions as a powerful force in American industry. So, on June 27, 1936, FDR officially accepted the Democratic Party's nomination for a second term. His Republican challenger was Governor Alfred M. Landon of Kansas, a progressive who had supported several New Deal programs. Republicans hoped that critics of Roosevelt like Long, Coughlin, and Townsend would unite their followers and siphon off enough Democratic votes to give Landon a chance at victory. However, this strategy lost traction when Huey Long was assassinated in 1935. Dr. Carl Weiss, angry over Long's treatment of his father-in-law, shot and killed the 42-year-old senator, eliminating one of the most prominent critics. And the 1936 election, Roosevelt demonstrated his unmatched political dominance, winning in a landslide, carrying every state except for Maine and Vermont, with a staggering popular vote of 28 million to just 17 million for Landon. This victory marked the largest winning margin in U.S. history to that point, and the Democrats also solidified their control of Congress with a majority of 77 to 19 in the Senate, and the House of Representatives, 328 to 107. Roosevelt's overwhelming success was built on a powerful electoral coalition that would shape American politics for years to come, and while maintaining strong support for traditional Democrats in both the North and South, he made significant inroads into the West. In northern cities, his New Deal policies attracted the support from ethnic communities benefiting from welfare programs, and the middle class rallied behind him as well, along with intellectuals inspired by the wave of new ideas. Perhaps most notably, African Americans for the first time were voting overwhelmingly for Democratic presidents, and Roosevelt's broad coalition underscored the transformative nature of his presidency, uniting diverse groups across the country and reinforcing his role as a political force capable of reshaping the American political landscape. Okay, so Roosevelt wants to pursue even bolder measures to combat the Great Depression. However, he believes that the Supreme Court, as conservative as it is the thing standing in his way. So he actually referred to it as a horse and buggy institution composed of 9 old men with an average age of 71. He was sort of right. The court had already struck down several New Deal laws, and with challenges to the Social Security Act and Wagner Act pending, Roosevelt feared the court would dismantle key parts of the Second New Deal. So to address this, Roosevelt and Attorney General Homer Cummings explored ways to make the court more supportive of its policies. Cummings proposed increasing the number of justices as Congress, not the Constitution, determined the size of the Supreme Court, which had varied from 6 to 10 members over the years, and at the time it was sitting at 9. On February 5, 1937, without consulting his cabinet, congressional leaders, or the justices themselves, Roosevelt announced a plan to add up to 6 new justices, 1 for each current justice over 70, and he proclaimed the reason for doing this was that the aging court was falling behind on its work, and he wanted them to be able to catch up. So, opponents quickly labeled this plan a court-packing scheme, and the proposal sparked a national controversy. Over the next 168 days, the country debated whether Roosevelt's plan was constitutional or simply an attempt to seize more power. Journalist Walter Lippmann accused Roosevelt of being drunk with power, while a Democratic senator called the plan mentally unsound, undemocratic, and reactionary in principle. Despite the backlash, Roosevelt remained adamant, insisting, "The people are with me, I just know it." Congress, however, was not. The Senate Judiciary Committee condemned the plan, declaring it a measure which should be so emphatically rejected that its parallel will never be presented to the free representatives of the free people of America ever again. On July 22, 1937, they defeated the Judicial Reorganization Act, and the defeat was the worst political setback of Roosevelt's career, as it tarnished his reputation, weakened his influence, and fractured the Democratic Party, with Southern Democrats in particular beginning to openly oppose Roosevelt's leadership. And despite this episode, one positive outcome did occur. It preserved the institutional independence of the Supreme Court and upheld the constitutional system of checks and balances between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government, exactly as the Constitution is designed to do. Okay, so by 1935 and 1936, the economy had finally started to recover, showing signs of life after years of stagnation. By early 1937, industrial output, in fact, surpassed pre-crash levels from 1929. However, Roosevelt became increasingly concerned about the rising federal deficits and inflation, and so, hoping to address these issues, he ordered significant cuts to government spending. This decision had a lot of unintended consequences. The economy stalls and then spirals into another sharp downturn, nearly as severe as the Great Depression's onset in 1929. Within just 3 months, unemployment jumped by 2 million, and at first Roosevelt chose to wait out the crisis like Hoover had done. However, when the spring of 1938 failed to bring improvement, he shifted course and asked Congress to approve a new federal spending program, which they did, authorizing $3.3 billion in expenditures. And while this spending provided some relief, full economic recovery is not going to occur until the United States mobilizes for World War II. Meanwhile, Roosevelt's momentum suffered significant blows as the court-packing controversy, widespread labor unrest marked by sit-down strikes, and the 1937 recession all weakens his influence. By the end of 1937 congressional session, only 2 notable New Deal programs had passed: the Wagner-Stegall National Housing Act, championed by Wagner once again, and which is going to create the U.S. Housing Authority to provide loans for cities to build public housing projects and subsidize rent for lower-income residents. Later during the war, it also financed housing for defense workers. The second was the Bankhead-Jones Farm Tenant Act, establishing the Farm Security Administration to help struggling farmers. Basically, it helped prevent foreclosures and enabled tenant farmers to purchase land. However, its impact was limited. Most tenant farmers eventually found more opportunities in military service or defense jobs during World War II, so that broadened their skills and impact. So by the late 1930s, Roosevelt faced mounting challenges within his party, and congressional Democrats began to split along regional and ideological lines, with conservative Southerners opposing the more liberal Northern wing, and many Southern Democrats resenting the growing influence of labor unions and African Americans voters within their party. At the 1936 Democratic National Convention, Senator Ellison Cotton Ed Smith of South Carolina declared he would not support any party that considered the black as a political and social equal, and other Southerners shared similar sentiments as criticism of Roosevelt extended beyond regional divisions. Many opponents, including some Southern Democrats, accused him of wielding too much power and spending excessive amounts of money. The growing resistance led Southern Democrats to ally with conservative Republicans to try and block further New Deal programs. And the midterm elections in 1938 delivered another blow as Democrats lost 7 Senate seats and 80 House seats, weakening their majority. By 1939, in his State of the Union address, Roosevelt acknowledged the shift in political dynamics, emphasizing the need to preserve our reforms rather than expand upon them. And the coalition of conservative Republicans and Southern Democrats had effectively stalled his legislative agenda, marking the end of the New Deal's most transformative period. Okay, so by 1939, the political momentum behind the New Deal began to fade, just as war broke out in Europe and Asia. Many New Deal programs had not succeeded or had been poorly designed and implemented, often hindered by bureaucratic struggles and mismanagement. Yet some programs made lasting changes to American life, like the Social Security Act, federal regulation of the stock market and banks, and minimum wage laws, federally insured bank accounts, and government-backed labor unions. However, the New Deal's greatest achievement was not its individual successes, but its demonstration that American democracy was able to adapt to changes in capitalism through government action and presidential leadership. Roosevelt reshaped the role of the federal government and the presidency as, for the first time in peacetime, the federal government took responsibility for managing the economy and ensuring social stability. Now, by the end of the 1930s, the scope and power of the national government had expanded significantly since 1932, and landmark laws created regulatory agencies and laid the groundwork for a social welfare system in the country. Perhaps most importantly, the New Deal restored hope to many who had been disheartened and desperate, and its reforms represented more than just an expanded government or an activist president. They marked a shift from earlier progressive ideas. Progressives like Roosevelt and Wilson had believed that government should aggressively regulate industry to ensure equal opportunities, but Roosevelt and his New Deal went further. They argued that the government should also provide a basic level of support for all Americans. This idea of government responsibility for citizens' welfare created a new sense of belonging and hope for many people, and for industrial workers, wearing union buttons became a point of pride. Ethnic communities, long excluded from the mainstream of American life, felt a sense of inclusion, and even though Southern Democrats imposed racial discrimination on New Deal policies, African Americans did begin to experience a new sense of hope and a shared desire for equal rights. However, the New Deal's biggest failure was its inability to end the Depression and restore full employment to the country. By 1939, nearly 10 million Americans, around 17% of the total workforce, remained unemployed, and it would take the economic demands of World War II to finally bring the country to full employment. Roosevelt's greatest strength was his pragmatic flexibility. He adapted his policies to what worked and discarded what didn't, and has made the New Deal both revolutionary and conservative. Roosevelt expanded the federal government's regulatory powers, laid the foundation for social welfare programs, yet he wasn't a socialist as his Republican critics claimed. Roosevelt sought to preserve capitalism while providing support to the vulnerable, and in this way the New Deal represented what we would refer to as a halfway revolution, fundamentally changing the country's social and political fabric. In a time of crisis, Roosevelt provided a more secure future for Americans. All right, so this will end up getting posted to here in